Good evening, and welcome to Eerie Echoes. Tonight, we descend into the misty peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, lands where every stone holds a story and every shadow hides a secret. These are not just legends, but true fears, lived and told by real witnesses. Turn off the lights, and remember, the mountains never forget, and they never forgive. Rain tapped against the tin roof of the porch in a steady, rhythmic beat. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like I was breathing steam. It was the final days of August, but on this side of the Appalachian forest, nightfall turned even summer into something heavy and dark. Laura and I had rented the cabin for a week-long escape. It sat at the very end of a winding dirt road, at least 30 minutes from the nearest town. No cell service, no Wi-Fi. At first, we liked that. We wanted to disappear for a while. The first evening was peaceful. We unpacked the groceries, sat on the porch listening to the rain, even turned off the lights just to sit in the dark. The forest smell, a mix of wet soil and resin, was thick enough to make you lightheaded. Near midnight, we went to bed. The bed sat in the corner of the room, right beside an old wooden door. We'd hung our coats there earlier. That door didn't lead outside directly. It opened to a back porch, but it was locked. The next morning, the room felt cooler than it should have. Laura was still asleep. I reached behind the door to grab my coat and saw it. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the coat pocket. I unfolded it. Scrawled in uneven, trembling letters was a single sentence. "Lock the doors at night." For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The paper was damp, as if it had been held in the moist air only minutes ago. I woke Laura immediately. She said maybe the owner had left it, but there was no way I would have missed it last night when we hung the coats. All day, it stayed in the back of my mind. The rain never stopped. The forest outside sank into a gray fog, dimming the inside of the cabin even in daylight. I checked every lock again. Everything was fine. That evening, the power flickered and went out for a few seconds. Even the sound of crickets outside paused for a heartbeat, before starting again. That pause somehow unsettled me more than the darkness. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but then I realized it was the creak of the porch steps. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Laura. She was already awake. We both stayed silent, listening. 2, 3, 4 steps. Then silence. I went to the kitchen for a flashlight, careful not to get too close to the window. My eyes had adjusted to the dark when a shadow moved across the porch. Quick, gone in an instant. Laura wanted to call the police, but our phones were dead to the outside world. The only thing we could do was turn off the lights and go back to the bedroom. I moved the coats, locked the door, and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep. Not at all. In the morning, we found muddy footprints on the porch floor. But worse was the new note taped to the bedroom door. This time, the handwriting was neater, clearer. "I know you saw me." Laura's hands were shaking as we packed. We drove away in the rain without looking back. Since that night, whenever I glance over my shoulder in a foggy forest, I sometimes think I see a shadow, and sometimes I still feel like there's a note waiting behind the door. That night, the sky was brighter than I'd ever seen it. The stars felt close enough to touch. Up here, in this high part of the Appalachian forest, there was no light pollution. That's why I'd chosen this place, to spend a few nights photographing the night sky and to get some quiet. The cabin was small but clean. One room with a little porch out front. The clearing around it wasn't wide. A few meters out, the trees began, tall and dense. But the wind was light that night, and the leaves only rustled occasionally. In the first hours, I sat on the porch, tripod set up, taking long exposures. The sky looked stunning, even in the images. Around midnight, I stepped inside to make some tea. When I came back out, the small flashlight I'd left on the edge of the porch step was gone. I scanned the area, but it wasn't there. I figured I must have dropped it, but it wasn't under the steps either. I let it go, went back inside. An hour later, I stepped outside again, and the flashlight was lying neatly in the middle of the porch floor. A faint unease settled in my chest. As I aimed the camera at the sky, I heard a soft snap from somewhere deep in the woods, like a branch breaking. It was far enough away that I ignored it. By 2 a.m., my camera battery had died. I went inside for the spare. That's when I noticed the tripod I'd left on the porch wasn't there. This time, I searched. About 6 meters away, near the back of the cabin, I found it, standing perfectly upright, its legs sunk slightly into the dirt. And it wasn't aimed at the sky anymore. It was facing directly into the trees. My mouth went dry. I grabbed the tripod, brought it inside, and locked the door. Around 3 a.m., a faint beam of light swept past the window. I pulled the curtain aside. The flashlight was on again. It lay in the center of the porch, shining straight toward the tree line. I stayed awake until dawn. The sky remained full of stars, but the magic of the night was gone, replaced by a quiet tension, the sense of something waiting. When the sun rose, the flashlight was off. The tripod was back where I'd left it, but on the porch steps were muddy footprints. They didn't lead into the forest, they led underneath the porch. My wife Emily and I had decided last winter to escape the city for a few days and rent a small cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. We'd been planning this trip for months. The photos online had warmed me instantly. Snow-covered pine trees, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney, a porch overlooking a frozen lake. It promised silence, nature, and peace. By the time we arrived, night had already settled in. It had taken us almost 4 hours from the city. During the last 30 minutes, my phone lost all signal, and the GPS became useless. We followed the printed directions the owner had given us, winding along dirt roads and sharp turns. The car's headlights cut through the bare trunks of the trees, the shadows stretching long and thin across the path. When we stepped inside, the cabin was warm compared to the biting cold outside. The smell of aged wood filled the air, blending with the crackle of the stone fireplace. While Emily began unpacking in the kitchen, I stepped out onto the porch. The lake was swallowed by darkness, its surface invisible, but there was a deep, heavy stillness in the air. No neighbors, no traffic, nothing but us, at the very end of the road. The first night passed quietly. We cooked a simple dinner, poured hot spiced wine, and talked by the fire. By 11, we were in bed. The only sound was the wind brushing over the roof, the occasional groan of the old wood. Sometime past midnight, I woke up with a strange feeling. I couldn't tell why. Emily was still asleep beside me. The faint light seeping through the curtains was the moon, reflecting off the snow outside. For reasons I still can't explain, I felt pulled toward the kitchen. My footsteps creaked softly on the wooden floor as I moved down the hall. When I reached the kitchen doorway, my eyes froze on the window. There, outside in the dark, stood a man. I couldn't make out every detail of his face, but his head was tilted slightly forward, and his eyes, they were locked on mine. For a second, my mind tried to convince me it wasn't real. I blinked. He was still there. I stumbled back, my chest pounding. "Emily," I whispered. At that moment, he tilted his head to the side, as if studying me. Then, without a word, he stepped back once and melted into the shadows. I rushed to the porch, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. When Emily came out, I was shaking. I told her what I saw. We thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service. No way to reach the owner either. Emily double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, while I found an old rifle hanging near the fireplace. I didn't even know if it was loaded, but just holding it gave me some comfort. We stayed awake in the living room, waiting for dawn. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. In front of the kitchen window, clear footprints marked the snow. But 2 steps away, they simply ended, as if the man had vanished. We decided to leave, but the roads were blocked with fresh snow from the night before. We had no choice but to stay another night. That afternoon, from the porch, I spotted movement deep in the trees, a shadow, brief but unmistakable. Someone was out there watching. That night, just as I was about to drift off, a faint sound came from the kitchen. Emily and I crept downstairs. One of the cupboard doors was open. We had locked everything earlier. Yet some of the plates had been moved. When I checked the back of the cabin, my heart nearly stopped. Footprints in the snow led straight to the small storage closet. I opened it slowly. Inside was a blanket and an empty can of food. Someone had been hiding here, only a few feet away from us, all night. The next morning, we packed the car and drove away without looking back. I told the owner what happened, but he only shrugged and said, "Sometimes there are hunters around here." I haven't stayed in a remote cabin since, because sometimes the danger isn't outside the door, it's already inside. Going somewhere alone, especially in the dead of winter, might sound pointless to most people. But I've always loved silence. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, clear my head, and spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd found it online. Old but sturdy. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a spot right on the edge of a frozen lake. It promised peace. The trip took hours. The last 20 kilometers, my phone went completely dead. The road narrowed and the trees seemed to press closer on both sides. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk was falling. The first thing I smelled when I opened the door was damp wood. Inside, the furniture was worn. The fabric on the chairs was frayed, the picture frames on the walls slightly crooked. But the thing that caught my attention most was the black, old-fashioned rotary phone sitting on a small wooden table in the corner of the living room. When I asked the owner about it, he smiled. "Cell service doesn't work out here," he said. "That's for emergencies." The cord ran into the wall, its plastic brittle with age. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first night went fine. I lit the wood stove, made a simple dinner, read a book. Around 11, I went to bed. I was just drifting off when the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence so sharply my heart jumped. I walked to the living room without turning on a light. I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said. Silence. No breathing. No static. Nothing. As if someone was there, completely still on the other end. I said, "Hello?" again, twice. No answer. I finally hung up, unsettled, but told myself it was a wrong number. I went back to bed. The next day, I hiked deep into the woods. The snow muffled my footsteps. It was beautiful, untouched. By the time I got back, the sun was sinking. I lit the fire, cooked dinner, settled in. A little after 10, the phone rang again. I answered. Silence again. But this time there was something faint, almost too soft to hear. A whisper. I couldn't make out words, just a slow, rhythmic murmur. "Who is this?" I asked. The whisper stopped. I hung up, a chill crawling up my spine. The next morning, I went to see the owner in person. He looked surprised to see me. I told him the phone had rung 2 nights in a row. He shrugged. "That line hasn't worked in years. Maybe the wind rattled it." Confused, I went back and checked the cord myself. It disappeared into the wall. But outside, the section running to the pole had been cut clean. That phone couldn't possibly work. That night, I planned to sleep early. But at exactly midnight, the phone rang. I picked it up, and I heard it. My own voice, from the night before, saying, "Who is this?" Word for word. Then, silence. And then a man's voice, deep, calm, unfamiliar. "Don't go outside tonight." The receiver slipped from my hand. My body went cold. I turned toward the window, only darkness. but I felt it. A weight in my chest, the undeniable sense that someone was close. I didn't sleep. I didn't turn off the lights. At sunrise, I packed my bag, left the keys in the owner's mailbox, and caught the first bus out of town. He called after me, but I didn't turn back. I've never rented a place with a landline since, because in that silent little cabin, someone out there knew exactly who I was, and they were listening. When I rented the small cabin by the lake, my plan was simple. 2 days away from the city, taking photos. It was early May. The air was neither too hot nor too cold. The lake stretched quietly in the middle of the forest, its surface so still it seemed the reflection was sharper than the real view. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the old rowboat tied to the dock. A thick rope ran through a metal ring, securing it in place. The paint on the boat was peeling, the oars inside rusted, like it hadn't been used in years. The owner didn't say much about the lake when he handed me the keys. Only, "Don't go swimming," with no explanation. I didn't think much of it. The first day passed in photographs, birds, thin wisps of mist dancing over the water, wildflowers along the shore. Everything seemed peaceful. By evening, the boat was still there. That night, I sat by the shore, watching the moon's reflection in the water. There were no sounds, not frogs, not crickets. It was as if the lake swallowed every noise around it. The next morning, coffee in hand, I stepped onto the porch and glanced toward the lake. The boat was no longer at the dock. It was floating in the middle of the water, swaying gently. The rope was still tied to it, but the other end had slipped free from the dock's ring. There was no wind, no current, and the thought of someone coming here during the night settled uneasily in my mind. Who? There were no other cabins nearby. The nearest town was half an hour away. By noon, I took the oars and rowed it back to shore, tying the rope again, this time with 2 knots. I went back to taking photos, trying not to think about it. By late afternoon, the sky turned a deep gray. As the storm approached, the lake grew even quieter. Sitting inside, waiting for the rain, I looked out the window. The boat was still in the middle of the lake, but it was different now. It was moving, slowly, forward, then back, as if someone invisible was rowing it. I stepped outside. The movement stopped. A second later, thunder cracked across the sky. I shut the doors and went back inside as the first drops began to fall. Around midnight, I woke up. From the window, I saw a faint glow on the water, like a lantern drifting slowly over the surface. But the storm clouds had blocked out the moon. That light wasn't coming from the sky. In the morning, the boat was back at the dock. The rope was tied, but my 2 knots were gone, replaced by a single, loose one. That was enough. I packed my things, left the key on the table, and loaded my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The boat was in the middle again, and one of the oars was dipping slowly into the water, as if guided by a hand I couldn't see. The house at the end of the road was in a place so remote the map barely got it right. The asphalt had ended nearly 3 kilometers back, replaced by a dry dirt path flanked by thick rows of trees. It was mid-August. The air was still, the sky a hazy gray. I'd found the listing online. The description read, "A peaceful escape in the heart of nature." But the reviews were strange. Most guests wrote some version of, "We left earlier than planned." None of them explained why. I met the owner in town, a man in his 60s who didn't talk much. When he handed me the keys, he said, "Don't spend too much time in closed rooms at night." When I asked what he meant, he just shrugged and got into his truck. When I arrived, the air inside was warm and stale. I opened every window. From the inside looking out, the forest seemed to lean in over the cabin, as if the trees were slowly closing the distance. The place was old, The wooden floor groaned in spots, and the ceiling fan gave a soft tick with every turn. After dinner, I sat on the porch. When darkness settled, the sound of crickets and night birds filled the air. But every so often, all the sounds would cut off completely. In those moments, the silence was so deep, I could hear my own breathing. Around midnight, the light in the living room flickered, not out, just dimmed for a second. The ceiling fan slowed to a stop, then began turning again. Before bed, I went to the kitchen for some water. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Sitting in the middle of the kitchen table was the paperback ID left on the porch earlier. I hadn't brought it in, I was sure of that. I told myself maybe I had absent-mindedly carried it in without thinking, though the thought didn't sit well. I lay down with the windows still open, letting the warm air and forest sounds drift in. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a faint dragging sound from somewhere inside, like fabric brushing over wood. I started to get up, but the sound stopped. The next morning, the salt shaker was on the floor, and the chair I'd left angled toward the porch was now folded up against the wall. On the second night, the air felt even heavier. Sitting on the porch, I heard the forest go silent again, this time for longer. It was as if the whole place had paused, waiting. Then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of a drawer sliding open. I walked in, and the kitchen drawer was halfway out. I decided to go to bed, but at around 3 a.m. I woke with a strange unease. Somewhere in the house, there was a soft click. The ceiling fan above me had stopped, though the power was still on. I turned on the lamp, and that's when I saw it. The same paperback from the porch, now resting neatly on my nightstand. I stayed up until dawn. I didn't hear anything else, but the feeling was constant. There was someone else here, breathing the same air. The next morning, I left. When the owner saw me back in town, he just nodded. "Most people don't make it through the night," he said. Thinking back now, the most disturbing part is, I still don't know what scared me, only that it was there. The tires of my car groaned with every curve, threatening to slide on the ice-covered mountain road. The narrow path ahead vanished into the pines. On the map, this place was marked as the quiet side of the mountain. Out here, there were no other settlements. I wasn't here for a vacation. I was here for work, a photography project documenting wildlife in the northern slopes of the Appalachians. An old man in town had recommended this cabin. "It's quiet," he'd told me, his voice low. "But at night, don't go out too much." By the time I reached the cabin, darkness had already fallen. It was a single-room wooden structure. Inside, there was a wood stove, a small table, and an old clock radio beside the bed. Through the window, all I could see were the shadows of snow-covered trees. The first night passed quietly. Only the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of wind against the walls. But the next morning, I saw footprints in the snow right outside my window. They didn't go both ways, just toward the cabin. There were no tracks leading back. I spent the day shooting photos in the woods, the cold biting into my fingers. When I returned, the footprints had been buried by fresh snow. I told myself it was probably just a hunter. The second night, around 1 a.m., I woke to a sound. Heavy, deliberate steps in the snow. 3 steps, a pause. 3 more. I got out of bed, kept the lights off, and eased toward the window. Peeking through the curtain, I saw a shadow slowly circling the cabin. No flashlight, no visible face. Eventually, it slipped out of sight. I stayed awake all night, my hand resting on the hunting knife by the stove. At dawn, I found new tracks behind the cabin, leading toward a narrow trail that sloped down the mountain. Following it with my eyes, I spotted the faint outline of an old hunting lookout tower among the trees. It was rotting, its ladder broken, the air around it carrying a cold, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The third night, the temperature had dropped sharply. I was sitting by the stove when a low, muffled engine sound drifted from somewhere beyond the ridge. It didn't approach. It circled. Then it stopped. Just as I was about to get into bed, the sound returned. This time, footsteps. Closer. I moved to the window. In the moonlight, someone was standing right in front of the cabin, watching me, motionless. I don't know how long they stood there. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, they stepped slowly to the right and disappeared from view. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and waited, the knife still in my hand. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Just as I began to relax, a faint creak came from the back of the cabin, the back door. I moved toward the kitchen, silent, the knife tight in my grip. The door handle shifted slightly as if someone was testing it from outside. I froze, my breath shallow. Then the handle eased back into place. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep, not a single second. When the sun rose, I packed my things. As I circled the cabin one last time, I spotted a small piece of paper lying in the snow by the back door. The handwriting was shaky. "You didn't lock the door while you were sleeping." That S when I realized what I saw on the quiet side of the mountain wasn't just a threat from outside. From the very first night, in the stillness, I had already been watched. It was the last week of October. On this side of the Appalachian forest, the leaves had turned to deep reds and burnt oranges, with some branches almost bare. The sky hung gray, but the air was still mild. I was looking for a quiet place to spend a few days writing, away from the city. The cabin I rented stood alone in the woods. Beside it was a barn that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door was shut, its boards cracked in places, the rusty hinges barely holding on. The owner didn't mention the barn when he handed me the keys. I didn't ask, assumed it was just used for storage. I spent the first day inside writing. In the late afternoon, I stepped onto the porch, and my eyes drifted toward the barn. The door was still closed. Other than the rustle of leaves in the breeze, there was no sound. The next morning, before heading out for a walk, curiosity got the better of me. I tried the barn door. It wasn't locked, just closed. When I pushed it open, the inside was nearly empty. A few old wooden crates, cobwebs in the corners, and scattered remnants of hay on the floor. I closed it and went about my day. That day, I hiked through the woods for hours. When I came back in the evening, I didn't notice anything unusual. But the next morning, stepping out onto the porch, I saw the barn door slightly ajar. Inside, in the corner where there had been nothing the day before, sat a pair of old mud-caked leather boots. I was sure they hadn't been there yesterday. For a moment, I told myself maybe I'd overlooked them. I shut the door again and returned to my writing. On the third morning, the barn door was ajar again. This time, there was something else. A rusty bucket with half a loaf of bread inside. The bread was fresh. That detail bothered me more than anything. That night, I sat on the porch, keeping the barn in my sight. The air was crisp, and the sound of leaves had all but stopped. As the hours dragged on, I got tired and went inside. By morning, the barn door was wide open. When I stepped inside, my stomach tightened. The boots and bucket were still there, but something new had been added. My blue water bottle, the one I had used yesterday, the one that had been sitting in my bag inside the cabin. I picked it up, walked back to the house, and started packing. I didn't care what the explanation was. I was leaving. I locked the cabin, left the key on the table, and carried my bag to the car. Just before I drove away, I glanced back at the barn. The door was half open. The water bottle was gone. And in the shadows inside, I saw something else that hadn't been there before. I couldn't make out what it was before the door slowly swung shut on its own.